Basic Brewing Radio is sponsored in part by the American Homebrewers Association. This February, the American Homebrewers Association encourages you to show your homebrew equipment some love by getting it cleaned up for your next brew day. Use promo code CLEAN to receive free PBW cleaning tablets when you join or renew your AHA membership in February, or while supplies last. Visit homebrewersassociation.org/basicbrewing for details. Get your free PBW with promo code CLEAN and find February inspiration with recipes for winter seasonals and craft beer clones, beer and food pairing suggestions, and much more by visiting homebrewersassociation.org/basicbrewing today. That's homebrewersassociation.org/basicbrewing with the promo code CLEAN. Welcome to Basic Brewing Radio for Thursday, February 17th, 2022. I'm James Spencer. Here at Basic Brewing Radio, we're all about home brewing. This week, Mika Laitinen, author of the blog BrewingNordic.com, joins us to talk about brewing with rye. Rye can add some interesting character to your beer, but it can be tricky in the mash tun. Mika shares some tips and some recipe ideas as well. If you go to basicbrewing.com, you can find archives of our audio and video shows, and if you go to basicbrewingshop.com, you can find our DVDs and our brewers' logbooks. You can follow me on Twitter and Instagram at Basic Brewing, and find our show page on Facebook as well. If you want to support us financially, check out patreon.com/basicbrewing, and many thanks to everybody who's helping out in that way. If you go to patreon.com/basicbrewing, you can see a long list of stuff that you can access if you sign up as a supporter. I'm in the planning phase for my next beer. About all I know right now is that it's going to have some rye, and it's going to be a lager. Now, one of the recipes Mika and I are going to talk about today is a malty rye Doppelbock, and that's really caught my attention. This sounds really good to have on tap, in the cold months and even into spring. I'll probably put my own twist on it, as I usually do. I want to try toasting some rye, as Mika and I will talk about. And that is if I can get my oven to act right. It's sort of off topic, but it's an electric oven that's running about 50 degrees too hot, as I discovered when I tried to cook a pecan pie for the holidays. The oven is 25 years old, so maybe it's time for a new one. I wonder if they make basic ovens anymore that don't have, Bluetooth and an app and try to talk to your refrigerator and such. We'll have to see. I used my wonky oven to bake some hamburger buns this weekend. I got a wild hair and thought I'd get into some baking. The buns wound up looking good and tasting pretty good, but I think I overworked the dough because the insides were more like kind of like dense pretzels. The weird oven probably had something to do with it as well. I need to quit watching so many baking shows, or maybe I need to watch more baking shows. I do like putting yeast to work in jobs other than beer, and it seems like baking and brewing go hand in hand. Speaking of things other than beer, let's talk about the Ancient Collection from our friends and sponsors Ricky and Kelly from Groenfell and Havoc Meaderies in Vermont. The Ancient Collection is made up of 3 big, delicious meads that celebrate the long traditions of mead. Groenfell and Havoc make a bunch of fairly moderate gravity, very quaffable meads, as you know, and the Ancient Collection goes a bit beyond. There's Veneer, which comes in at 15.9% ABV and is made with pure wildflower honey fermented on 3 European strains of yeast and aged on carved ash wood and oak. Hegear is a 13.4% mead that blends European cherries with wildflower honey and is aged on cherry wood. And Bragi, at 12.5%, features wildflower honey, black currants, elderflowers, rose hips, and a touch of juniper berry. All sound very good to me, and you can purchase the full Ancient Collection for 10% off and get free shipping for orders over $75, or you can buy them individually if you like. Check out the Ancient Collection and all of the honey-based deliciousness at family-owned and operated Groenfell.com. That's Groennfell. Okay, let's talk to Mika Laitinen, author of Viking Age Brew and BrewingNordic.com, and get some rye-based inspiration. Mika Laitinen, welcome back to Basic Brewing Radio.
Thanks. I'm glad to be here again.
I was looking for an excuse to talk to you because I follow you on Instagram, and you always post such interesting photos of yourself and, up there in Finland and the surrounding areas, and tasty-looking beers and interesting-looking, native looking costumes and such. And so I looked at your website, and BrewingNordic.com, and an article popped up at the beginning there that caught my attention, Brewing with Rye. And I've had in my mind for the past few weeks of brewing a rye lager. So I'm hoping that our conversation today will help steer me in the right direction to fashion a tasty rye lager.
Good. Lager is a good way to brew a rye beer because rye beer is somewhat grainy and rusty, and lagering will smooth everything out, and it will be just a beautiful and a complex beer.
You're making me thirsty already. It's the first thing in the morning here, so.
Yeah, I eat rye bread almost daily, and I really like the flavor of rye in both bread and beer.
So rye has a particular flavor characteristic in bread. What does rye bring to beer?
When I started to experiment with rye 10 or 15 years ago, I wanted to capture the flavor of rye bread into beer, but then I noticed that rye beer doesn't taste like a rye bread. It's quite different. And the rye in beer tastes more like a nuts and toffee, and there's some grainy, rustic character which is very difficult to describe. Mm-hmm. And of course there's also rye specialty malts, which are really special and different from barley specialty malts. They can have their own very distinct flavors, like red berries or bread crust or something like a raisin toffee like flavors.
Now, we're familiar with you from your book, Viking Age Brews, which talks about Sati Farmhouse Ale. But does rye lend itself to more than just traditional beers?
Absolutely. I think rye beers have been shadowed by the conventional beer styles and traditional beers because the best rye beers I have brewed are not brewed according to any traditional or conventional beer styles. I think it really can be used as very creatively in different kind of beers.
There, and you in this article on BrewingNordic.com, you've got several recipes that look delicious that people can look at and get inspiration from. But brewing with rye brings some particular, let's say, challenges or difficulties, right?
Yes, especially if the beer is going to be really a rye beer with a strong rye flavor, and the proportion of rye is going to be more than 15%. Then there needs to be some adjustments to the brewing. Otherwise, it's not not going to be a so good rye beer.
And what are the challenges that rye brings? I mean, why should we be cautious?
And the major challenge is the high beta-glucan content of rye. It makes the beer very oily and viscous and thick, and in very slight kind of oiliness and silkiness is very good. But if it's going to be very very thick and viscous, it's going to taste and feel kind of odd in the mouth, and it's going to also make the lautering very difficult because of the high viscosity. So it's you really need to pay attention to the mashing and lautering phases of rye beers.
After a conversation with Stan Hieronymus years ago, where he told me that you can brew 100% wheat malt beer, but the challenges there with the lautering. Then when I got into brew in a bag, I brewed successfully some 100% wheat beers. So I said, "Oh, rye, you can get malted rye. I can make 100% malted rye beer using brew in a bag." And so I shot for an original gravity of around 1050, standard gravity. And the challenges presented themselves quickly. And to cut to the end, the finished beer it was delicious. I brewed kind of a hoppy IPA with this 100% rye malt, but the finished beer had a viscosity of cough syrup, very kind of slimy and viscous, and it was fun to watch the bubbles come up because they were like in slow motion coming up from the bottom of the glass. So is that the kind of character that we're trying to avoid?
Yeah, some rye beers are very thick and slimy, but I like to do a proper beta-glucan mash to reduce this kind of viscosity and get viscosity slightly slower, slightly down and avoid the kind of slimy viscosity, because for me it doesn't taste so nice. I like silky, smooth, oily mouthfeel like in oatmeal stouts and porters, but in some rye beers the slimy characters can be too much. So that's what I recommend to avoid with the proper mashing techniques.
Now, with a low gravity beer, the addition of rye can help boost the body of the beer and actually enhance that mouthfeel, so that the beer, the low alcohol beer, doesn't taste thin. But there is a balance. So, talk about your mash profile and the temperatures and the times that you would use to knock down that sliminess or the viscosity of the rye.
Yeah, if you can do step mash, it's really simple, because you just need to do the low temperature beta-glucan rest at around 35 to 40 Celsius, which is around 100 Fahrenheit. One step for 20 to 30 minutes at that temperature is enough to break down the sliminess of rye beers.
And then in the article, you also recommend doing a mash out at the end, raising the temperature at the end of the mash.
Yes, that will help to reduce the viscosity and make the lautering easier. But it is not necessary if your lautering system is really really good and you don't have any lautering problems.
And of course, I use brew in a bag, so I don't have to worry about a stuck sparge in any way. But if you're using a traditional mash tun, should you consider depending on how much rye you use, should you consider adding something like rice hulls to as an insurance policy?
Yeah, it depends a lot on the rye content. 15% rye is not going to be very difficult to lauter, but above 20 or 25, it will become very slow and it can even get stuck. So then you should add rice hulls or some kind of coarse matter. Of course, the traditional brewers used juniper branches and straw in a lauter tun, and it was very effective way to lauter even the most viscous and difficult mashes.
So what is the sweet spot as far as how much rye? I guess it depends on the style and what you're trying to achieve. But what are the ranges of percentage of rye that you would add typically? And maybe you can talk about how it varies between the styles.
Yeah, that's really important point. 10% is something like a spice. It's not going to be a proper rye beer. It will just add some minor details to the beer, but then about 15% it's going to start tasting like a rye, and most of my rye beers are between 15 to 25% of rye. So something like 20%, it's already very noticeable in a flavor. It's going to taste really like a rye piece, not a side note.
And very seldom have I, even with 100% rye beers, people say, "Oh, I get spice." From rye you get spice, but I wouldn't describe the character that I get from rye as spice. Now I did sample a rye IPA from Ozark Brewing called A-Frame. That on the nose I really got that kind of typical, what some would characterize as rye spice, but in the flavor I didn't get that. So how would you characterize it? Can you nail it down?
Yeah, me too. I don't recall having a spice flavor from rye. Perhaps just a hint of black pepper, but more typically I get kind of complex grainy character and nuts and toffee, and then hints of red berries, but not spicy flavor. It's kind of odd description for me.
I'm really liking the latest beer that I put on tap recently. It's my passion fruit puree Pilsner. Slightly tart and extremely drinkable. It's sort of like a shandy in a way. I added the passion fruit puree into a beer that I fermented with a winter seasonal from our friends and sponsors Imperial Organic Yeast. L26 Pilgrimage is a favorite of professional brewers, and we're fortunate as home brewers that we can have access to it. Pilgrimage will produce lagers with a very clean profile that accentuates the flavors and aromas of Pilsner malt and noble hops. And I can attest to that. My base beer for this Pilsner was delicious on its own before I added the fruit. Now, I have another pack of Pilgrimage, and I'm looking forward to seeing what it does with a rye-based beer. We love Imperial with a pitch rate of 200 billion cells in each easy-to-open package. I like to say my airlocks are usually bubbling before bedtime, and my stir plate is dusty because I don't use it anymore to make starters for moderate gravity 5-gallon batches. Even this lager. Ask your local homebrew store about L26 Pilgrimage from Imperial Organic Yeast, and check them out at imperialyeast.com. That's imperialyeast.com. And I brewed my passion fruit Pilsner using my Warthog electric system from our friends and sponsors Desiree and Dave of HighGravityBrew.com. Mika and I talk a lot in this show about doing mashes with more than one mash rest. And with my electric brew-in-a-bag system with the Warthog controller, multiple step mashes are easy. I just switch the system to the mash mode, dial in the desired rest temp, and it's rock solid until it's time to dial up the temperature to the next level. And you can just switch over to the boil mode after that and precisely control the amount of power going to the element, giving you the vigorous boil that you want. HighGravityBrew.com can take the pain out of propane, and you can save $75 off a Warthog system or controller by using the code EBC75BB. That's family-owned and operated, HighGravityBrew.com. That's HighGravityBrew.com. And what forms of rye do you use? I've mostly used just the malted rye and the flaked rye, but there's a lot more out there, isn't there?
Yeah. Nowadays, I like to always use malted rye. I have tested also flaked rye, but I feel that the unmalted rye is more grainy, and therefore I like better malted version of rye. But then there's different varieties of rye malts. There's pale rye malt, and then there's caramel rye malt and chocolate rye malts, which are really, really special. And in my best rye beers, I like to combine all these different kind of rye malts to get the maximum rye flavor, like pale rye malt, caramel rye malt, and chocolate rye malt. It's going to be really, really good and complex rye beer.
And does the potential for like a more viscous character, is that maintained after the processing of the rye to make these specialty malts and grains?
It seems that the rye specialty malts are not contributing much to the viscosity. So the main source of viscosity is the pale rye malt, and not the caramel rye malt or chocolate rye malt.
And you also talk about toasting rye malt. How would we do that, and what benefits, what characteristics would we get from that?
Yeah, I like to use the medium range or light roast malts, which in a barley world we have amber malt and brown malts, but with rye there's very little options. There's some commercial kind of biscuit rye malts or perhaps even amber rye malts, but mostly we need to toast the grains and malts ourselves, and I think it's really special flavor which can be obtained with this kind of toasting in the oven, like 30 to 45 minutes in a just a domestic oven, toasting for at 175 Celsius. But it's going to add a really nice bread crust, toasty bread, and nutty flavor to the malt. And when you use this kind of malt soon afterwards, it's going to taste really fresh, unlike any malt you can buy.
And would this be just dry, say on a sheet pan, or laid out in one layer, I'm assuming?
Yes, very very thin layer on a sheet, baking sheet, and it's not going to be a big amount what you can and fill into just a kitchen oven. But if you use just something like 5 to 10%, you can make one toast will make enough for one typical home brewing batch.
And what percentage of the mash would that be?
Um, Usually, it's 5 to 10% is really
Okay.
really good.
And what?
It will taste, but not overpoweringly.
Yeah. What is the toasting? I guess it might depend on your preferences and what you're trying to achieve. But what is the level of toast? What indicators do you see or smell when the rye gets toasted to that to the sort of sweet spot?
Yeah, it's this kind of toasting requires some practice because you cannot see the proper toasting level on the outside. You cannot just look at the oven window and decide when it's ready. You need to pull out some sample of few grains and split them and check them. And usually the proper level of toasting gives kind of brown paperback color, and it will taste like a nuts and toasted bread, but not like coffee. You can make a kind of coffee tasting malt, but the best flavor which I like best is it's going to be below the coffee level and more like a nuts and toasted bread. That's what I'm aiming for.
And if it's anything like my experience with trying to toast things, there's like a narrow window of opportunity where it's not done, it's perfect, it's burnt.
Yeah, exactly. And the grains will toast very unevenly. So you just need to do some kind of averaging when you judge the proper toasting level.
Mm-hmm.
Some grains will be very dark and some will be very light, and it is the average which matters.
And your oven may have hot spots that you some areas of the sheet might get toasted a little more than others at a different rate. So there's
exactly, and it depends on the how thick layer you have in the grains.
Mm-hmm. So let's talk about some of your recipes, and I might need your help in pronouncing some of these. Like the first one on the list is it rongotius?
In Finland we say rongoteus, but I'm not sure where that name originally comes. It's some kind of god of rye.
Oh.
We say rongoteus.
And this is a beer with an original gravity of 1068 and a final gravity of 1017. So it's pretty chewy.
Yeah, it's very malty and very sweet, but not too sweet. It's going to be still very drinkable rye beer.
And how would you describe the character? What's it closest to?
We talk about beer styles. The closer thing is some kind of rye bock, or if you used phenolic yeast, then you get some kind of Belgium Abbey kind of beer. Not exactly, but that in that direction. So it's going to be very, very malty, low on hops, lots of different kind of dark, malty and grainy flavors like toffee, raisins, chocolate, cocoa, toasted bread, and also some kind of deep caramel notes.
It sounds like a tasty cold weather beer.
Yeah, it is. It's very good wintertime beer.
So we're talking 55% Pilsner malt, 25% Vienna malt, 14% pale rye malt, 4.5% caramel rye malt, and then 1.5% chocolate rye malt. So there's a lot of rye in there, and that would account for the relatively higher finishing gravity. But I'm assuming that where the recipe calls for rests at the lower temperatures there to kind of mitigate that a bit.
Yeah, of course you can affect the finishing gravity a lot by choosing different kind of yeast. So if you like drier, you can choose a yeast which will take it lower. But that kind of finishing gravity is very good for enhancing the malt character and the maltiness and the graininess of rye.
Sure. Now, you talk in here a bit about mash thickness, or the relatively dryness of the mash that you start out with. Is that right? And why would you do that?
Yeah, there's one trick which makes the beta-glucan rest much easier, and that is using very little water for the first beta-glucan rest. I usually use around half of my mashing water for the first beta-glucan rest. And then when I'm heading for the saccharification rests, then I can add the rest of the water and use the water to really raise the temperature. So it's, at least with my system, it makes mashing a lot easier.
And I've got an electric single pot system, so I can cheat. I can just turn the knob on the temperature controller to raise the temperature, which is a handy thing. So there's, if you have a system like that, you can dial it in and really, play with these mash rest temperatures to really get, dial in what you want.
Yeah, and if you don't need this kind of trick, you can just add all the water at once in the beginning, and then start raising the temperature from the 100 Fahrenheit beta-glucan rest to the proper saccharification rest at 150 Fahrenheit.
You have a recipe for a rye porter, which is a twist on a traditional style. Original gravity 1065, final gravity 1020 for an ABV of 6%. 74% of the malt bill is pale ale malt, so still relying mostly on barley. But then 12% pale rye malt, 8% toasted rye malt, which we just talked about, 4% chocolate rye malt, and 2% dehusked black malt, I imagine mostly for color. And you specify a Kvike or an ale yeast, neutral or moderately fruity. So that sounds delicious. So how does the rye combine with the darker beers? I've had most of the rye beers I've had, or the hoppy kind of amber color beers. But it seems like the richness of the rye and the added body, it seems like it would really almost bring kind of a milk stout kind of character to a beer like this.
Yeah, the rye porter is really special, and it's really a favorite of my friends. They are really crazy about my rye porter, and it's quite similar to oatmeal stout, or if you brew an oatmeal porter. The mouthfeel is similar, but then there's more graininess and more deepness on the grain level. So oats will bring out the very silky, smooth mouthfeel, but it doesn't add that much flavor. But the rye will add both mouthfeel and the very complex, grainy flavor as well.
Let's take a quick break to talk about our friends and sponsors at Tavour. Tavour is a way to select delicious craft beers that you may not be able to find in your area and have them delivered to you. It's not a Beer of the Month club where someone chooses the beer for you. You only pay for the beer that you choose over the course of the month. Signing up for Tavour is free. Just create an account at Tavour.com. That's T-A-V as in Victor, O-U-R.com, and download their iPhone or Android app. You'll receive notifications for 2 new beers each day that are available for purchase with in-depth tasting notes from Philip at Tavour. This month, look for Wild Ales from Jester King. And Drecker is releasing beers from both their Brains and Chonk series, along with a bunch of fruited sours and Imperial Nipas. And from Brooklyn, Tavour is having stouts and Schwartz beers by Grimm Artisan Ales. If you're not interested in the beers that you see, no worries. Just skip the ones you don't want. However, when you see something that you do want, and you will, don't wait. Just click on it and add it to your crate. Your beer arrives fresh every few weeks, allowing you enough time to fill a box and pay the least shipping. Why don't you check it out? It doesn't cost anything to sign up, and there's no obligation to purchase anything. In fact, if I can ask you a favor, go to Tavour.com, T-A-V as in Victor, O-U-R.com, or download the app, and when you sign up, enter the promo code Basic Brewing, all one word, and you'll get $10 off your first shipment of $25 or more. Again, it's free to sign up. There's no obligation to purchase. Sign up at Tavour.com or with the Tavour app and enter Basic Brewing as the promo code. The Ryenator is a multi-rye Doppelbock. Starts out at 1077 with a final gravity of 1020, which again is pretty chewy. An ABV of 7.5%, 70% Pilsner malt, 15% pale rye malt, 10% melanoidin, 4% caramel rye malt, and just 0.7% of black malt for coloring. And you recommend a lager yeast, a clean Kveik, or a clean ale yeast. Now this sounds interesting for my purposes, since I've got that packet of lager yeast. So what does does I guess this is just like a Doppelbock plus, right? It's even more so.
It's very. The recipe is very similar to the classic Doppelbock of Eyinger, the German commercial Doppelbock. But then I have changed the malts to rye.
Is there an advantage to lagering for a longer period of time? Do you really see a change in character of the rye over time during the lagering phase?
Absolutely. I think rye beers are really good for lagering because the lagering will smooth out the graininess of rye, and they will still leave the fantastic complexity of rye into the beer. So it's really going to be a special kind of bock with this kind of recipe. When you have a bread crust flavor and toffee, nuts, and red berries, really smooth, silky mouthfeel, and the lagering takes the coarse graininess away. So it's really going to be a smooth and fantastic beer.
Speaking of beers that you may want to lay down for a while, you have a recipe for a rye wine. Instead of a barley wine, this is a rye wine. 85%, or starting gravity of 1104, final gravity of 1025 for an ABV of 10%. 85% of the malt bill is pale ale malt, 11% pale rye, 3% caramel rye, and 1% chocolate rye. Now that sounds that sounds delicious, and I would assume that again with such a big malt bill, normally you would retain a lot of liquid in the malt bill, but I would assume that if you're doing, say, a traditional lautering setup where you're also adding a bunch of rye, do you have to compensate in your brewing liquid for all of that water retention?
Yeah, the rye malt seems to retain more water than barley malt. So if you want to calculate all your brew water beforehand, you need to add some amount of water to your sparge water because the rye will retain more water. It's going to be something like 20 to 30%.
Oh wow! That's considerable.
Yeah, of course it depends on the rye content, but.
So does the final gravity of the rye wine is 1025, but the ABV is 10%. So it would seem does the balance of the higher alcohol sort of mitigate the higher finishing gravity to make this beer more drinkable?
Yes, this beer is not hard to drink. It's quite quaffable. It's the body is quite heavy and silky, but still it's not going to be kind of. It's not in a way some modern pastry stouts are good for drinking in small sips. This is very drinkable beer, despite the high alcohol and high gravity.
And how would you characterize or compare, say, a traditional barley malt to the rye? Say, if you had a beer with a similar finishing gravity, which would be 100% barley beer, and one that has a significant portion of rye, is there a difference in the perceived sweetness between the two, even if they were to finish at this same gravity?
There is. Rye makes a beer slightly drier because of the graininess. Of course, that will smooth out if you store this kind of beer for a long time. But on average, rye beers are slightly drier compared to the barley wine, barley beers of same gravities.
Again, you're making me thirsty.
Yeah, that's why the finishing gravities are slightly higher than with average barley beers.
Now, of course, the author of Viking Age Brew would have to have a sati recipe in here, and you do have a rye sati. Is rye typically used? I guess it depends maybe on the region of the country or of the world where you are, as far as whether rye makes it into traditional sati recipes.
Yeah, it does. A lot of people think that sati is always a rye beer, but it isn't really always a rye beer. In some regions it is barley only beer, and in most of the regions satis contain a small amount of dark rye malt. But then there's a region in a western Finland where they like to use really high amounts of rye, something like more than third of the grain bill is rye.
Wow.
And some sahtis even have something like a 50, 60 or 70% of rye.
Oh my goodness.
So it's really totally different from typical barley sahti and average sahti.
And that's just people basically brewing with what's available.
Yeah, in the area where this kind of rye sahti is popular, a lot of the brewers are farmers who grow rye, and they are using their own rye, either unmalted or malted.
Your recipe, it's the starting gravity range is 1092 to 1097. Final gravity from 1025 to 1030 with an ABV of 8 to 9% and an IBU of 0, which we don't see much. 50% or 57% Pilsner malt, 18% light Munich malt, 18% pale rye malt, 7% toasted rye malt, and 5 liters of juniper branches, which are optional, and then the kveik or the baker's yeast. So how would you characterize this beer? When we're tasting this, what are the tasting notes?
Well, this beer is really special and difficult to describe because it's some very thick beer, but still quite drinkable, and the finishing gravity is quite high, but it's not too sweet. It's quite malty and kind of chewy, but not cloying sweet. And then there's a lot of toffee, bready flavors from rye.
And does the rye, when you combine it with a yeast that's tending to give you sort of the more phenolic character, cloves or the bananas or things like that, I would imagine that the peppery character of the rye might accentuate those as well.
Yes, it does. But the sahti brewers who are traditionally brewing this kind of rye sahti, they like to ferment at slightly lower temperature and keep the fermentation flavor really subdued. So they are really targeting for the malt flavor and not for the spicy and banana flavor of the traditional sahti yeast.
And sahti is traditionally consumed fairly quickly, right?
Yes, but rye sahti is slightly different because it seems to be requiring slightly longer maturation time. Many rye sahti brewers have said that their sahti is best at 4 weeks after brewing, and while in a barley region, most brewers are starting to drink their sahti after 2 weeks of brewing.
Wow. Well, you've given me a lot of sort of grist for the mill, as it were, as to as to what to think about in formulating my next recipe. And so I encourage everybody, if you're intrigued by the conversation, you should go to brewingnordic.com. Well, you should go there anyway, just because there's a lot of good stuff out there. And also, for more on brewing the sahtis, Mika's book, Viking Age Brew, is also well worth the read. So I appreciate your spending time with us again, Mika.
Yeah, thanks. It has been a really good conversation about rye beers, and I believe and hope that some of this kind of rye beers will be future beer styles. They are not beer styles yet, but perhaps in the future they will be this kind of beer styles.
Well, thanks again to Mika. I like the sound of a toasty rye doppelbock, or something similar. I appreciate the information and inspiration as always. If you have brewing questions, show suggestions, or just want to say howdy, write to james@basicbrewing.com or just fill out the contact form on basicbrewing.com. And please don't forget to tell us where you're from. Check out our mobile-friendly shop at basicbrewingshop.com. Thanks to everybody supporting us through our Patreon page. Special goodies coming your way. Check that out at patreon.com/basicbrewing. That's all until next time. Until then, thanks for listening, everybody. I'm James Spencer. Production help for Basic Brewing Radio and our website is provided by Kelly Dotson. Basic Brewing Radio is a production of Active Voicing. We'll talk to you next time, everybody. In the meantime, stay well and stay tuned. So long.